Oh, hello, everybody out there, and welcome to another fun filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where today we're tackling a genre that, in a specific sense, we haven't really talked about on this channel, but in other ways, we've talked about quite a few of the artists who ended up either intentionally or unintentionally having hits in this genre. And of course, we're talking about disco. Now, I call it a genre, but that's really a misnomer because in order to truly understand disco, you have to understand it from its three main characteristics. There's disco as a musical style or genre, there's disco as a social and cultural phenomenon, and there's disco as a technological phenomenon, which is the least discussed, but potentially the most important. So because we're on a music channel after all, let's talk about the musical background of disco. Now, disco at its essence is essentially a rhythmically simplified version of the soul and funk music that long predated disco and that had its origins decades before disco. To simplify things, after the Second World War, rhythm and blues started coalescing as a identifiable genre. It took elements of gospel and broader Black Christian music, combined it with elements of blues, and embraced a lot of the upcoming instruments of the time. So, various electric organs, electric pianos, electric guitars, electric basses, all instruments which existed before the 1950s, but really these instruments took the pop world by storm post Second World War. And by the late 60s, as this style became more rhythmically, harmonically, melodically, and in terms of arrangements, more sophisticated, we have a what some would call a subgenre of R&B, what others would call an outgrowth of R&B. I'm in that category. We have soul music. And then by the 70s, we have a full spectrum of various soulful music. We have pop based soul, we have soul that relies more on instrumental innovation than vocal. Think Kool and the Gang, who started out as a true jazz fusion band. We have soul influenced jazz fusion with high levels of virtuosity, where the people are drawn from a traditional jazz background. Think Herbie Hancock and the Headhunters. Think some of the things that the mixed race fusion groups were doing, the Tony Williams Lifetime, Weather Report, Mahavishnu, Chick Corea's Return to Forever. You have the vocal based soul. Think of the sort of Philly soul subset of this genre, where there's a lot of vocal harmony, usually four to five vocalists, sometimes more. In Chicago, you had the Shy Lights. So you had funk, Ohio Players. You had obviously Parliament Funkadelic, arguably the most important of the funk bands. You had the Isley Brothers, who sort of did a bit of all of these. They had vocal harmony, they had funk derived sort of rhythm, they had all sorts of very harmonically advanced and melodically advanced music. I mean, the Isley Brothers were really progressive soul, which definitely was a thing. So you had all of these different variants of the soul genre throughout the 70s, from the late 60s, frankly, all the way into the 80s. And at the same time, were in an environment where if you had to pick one style of music that was the general idiom of the pop music of the time, in other words, what kinds of sounds and what kind of arrangements influenced the pop style, mostly but not entirely, that was rock, with soul and R&B a very close second. And at the beginning of the decade, at least, a lot of people loved both the soulful stuff and the rock stuff. The musicians who made the stuff loved both generally. Now, what was disco music? Well, disco took the more pop facing soul of the era and simply put it to an unrelenting sort of up tempo, but not too fast beat. So that was your basic 4/4 disco beat that was very, and when I say unrelenting, you had that four on the floor bass drum, that boom, 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 boom. And on top of that, though, you still had in a lot of disco music some very sophisticated harmonies, very sophisticated melodies. And even though rhythmically it wasn't as adventurous as some of the other soul music going on in the 70s, it was still something that was very sophisticated from a point of view of arrangement. You had a lot of strings, a lot of synths, a lot of brass. You had some vocal harmony. And again, while no two disco songs are alike, just as no two soul songs are alike. And because of the rhythmic simplicity, there's a tendency to sort of consider disco as being all the same, but it really isn't. And I mean, you can look at it as a form of fusion, if you will. You can look at it as a form of outgrowth of soul. But the reasons why it came about had less to do with the musical landscape than with other things going on. And because, again, there were some artists that sort of blew up in the disco genre, weren't really heard from before, weren't really heard from after. But here's what's really interesting: most of the people with the biggest disco hits were either famous or even really famous before disco. Think the Bee Gees, think Diana Ross. The list could go on. Gloria Gaynor, to a degree, famous before, but so many artists who were big in the R&B or the soul or the pop world, they simply adapted their style to disco. You could even argue that jazz and fusion drummer Idris Muhammad made disco albums by incorporating some unrelenting rhythms with his more traditional, sophisticated drumming, and he fused those two things absolutely brilliantly. So that's the musical side of what's going on in disco. Well, what's the sociological side? Now, this I have to say is in many ways for me the least interesting, even though for the uptight critics it's the most interesting. So, let's just barrel through it. So at the beginning of the 70s, you had a musical landscape that, again, very diverse. You had the beginnings of hard rock, the beginnings of progressive rock. You had folk rock, you had country rock, you had southern rock, you had folk music, which sort of evolved into the golden age of the singer-songwriter. You had all of these different sub-varieties of soul that I talked about earlier. And all of that sort of coexisted, but there was a lot in terms of the thematic content. Not all, but a lot of early 70s music was very pensive, somewhat downtrodden, and there were some sociological reasons for it. The Vietnam War was going on. An anti war candidate, as such, didn't win the 1968 election. There were a lot of big assassinations at the end of the 60s. You can just listen to Dion's song, Abraham Martin and John, to learn more about that. And so, as the comedian who I love, Adam Carolla, says, a lot of, especially the lyrically driven music of the early 70s, tended to be very pensive and contemplative. They were paving down paradise and putting up parking lots. The fish were full of mercury. There were tin soldiers and Nixons coming. And for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. And this says less about the musical style of disco than the lyrical content. I think we covered the musical style of basically a rhythmically relentless version of a lot of the soul already going on. But in terms of lyrics, we went from, the paving paradise and the tin soldiers and 1, 2, 3, what are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. The next stop is Vietnam. Late 60s, I know, but you get the idea. And so now by the mid to late 70s, we're in the boogie wonderland. We're in the disco inferno. We're in I Feel Love. And we even see people from the rock genre get in on it. Rod Stewart, of course, both in terms of the musical style and in terms of the lyrical style, did If You Like My Body and You Think I'm Sexy, which is sort of a far cry from sort of the more gritty stuff like Gasoline Alley. So everyone was sort of getting in on it, almost everyone. ELO, you could argue, made a disco album in 1979, Disco Very Discovery. And so the lyrical and therefore thematic content was a sort of rebellion against the sort of Vietnam-centric, Watergate-centric lyrics of the early 70s, because after all, Nixon was gone, the Vietnam War was over, Jimmy Carter was in, the economy was bad, but at least you had a guy in the White House who was incredibly non-threatening. I know his funeral's actually today, without taking political sides on this channel. Rest in peace. I think most people from both sides of the sort of ideological spectrum agree he was a decent man. He never tried to harm anyone in his personal life. And so that was the era that we're talking about, and we're talking about, North America, but it obviously influenced the wider pop world, the US being the center of the pop music world for most of the existence of pop music as we know it. So we had that. And so now let's look at what I think is the most interesting element of disco that very few people talk about. And this is the technological aspect of disco. And I don't know why so few people talk about it. Maybe because they're too stupid to understand it. It could be. But the name disc is in the name, and that's referring to it's not referring to an ancient Greek discus, it's referring to a record, because the idea of a disco, which derives itself from the French discothèque, is that you're listening to music in a public setting that is played on a disc over a public address system. You're not listening to live musicians making music. And that itself was something of a revelation for several reasons. Now, long before the record was a thing, and I've talked about this before, I've talked about this as being a sort of predecessor to AI music. You, in the late 19th century, had the phenomenon of music being played without the presence of a musician. The late 19th and early 20th century saw the boom of player pianos. You had, for larger venues, public events, theaters, even self-playing organs with all sorts of special sound effects. Think a Wurlitzer organ played by a human musician, but this was played from rolls. It was played automatically. So the idea of being in a public setting as opposed to a home setting and listening to music not coming from a single or group of musicians playing before you wasn't a new idea by any means by the 70s, but the idea of listening to it on a record kind of was. Now, initially, people always grapple about who really came up with the first idea of the discotheque, the public space for dancing and socializing, where the primary music would be played on a recording as opposed to live. And much of this came from post-war Europe, because post-war Europe was absolutely devastated economically, where by contrast, North America was a booming an economic boom. And so to cut costs, and because a lot of people were dead, people would sometimes just put on a record and let people dance to it. Nothing fancy, seems intuitive, but some people say that was the first disco. But the disco as we know it, the 70s disco, owes a lot to technology, because frankly, before the middle of the middle or end of the 60s, the idea of having a small or medium-sized club with a robust PA that could play high quality recorded music throughout the night and stimulate people visually with the kind of light show that made it feel like something more sophisticated than, a school gymnasium where a crude monophonic PA system was playing a lyrically inaudible tune. The technology needed to be there. The great amplification systems that were now being used in the late 60s for big touring bands. I mean, The Who and the Grateful Dead, very undisco music, were pioneers in bringing high quality public address systems to the masses. In fact, Bob Heil, one of the great pioneers of the public address system from live music, he died just last year. We remembered him in our end of year stream that not enough people have you watched, so shame on you. Um, so by the 70s, you kind of have a surplus of a lot of high quality public address equipment. It was easier and easier to put together a high quality array of both high frequency, low frequency, and sub bass speakers that could fill a room of any size with loud yet clear music in terms of the fidelity. You had very robust, high quality phonographs, turntables by now. You had comparatively inexpensive but high quality mixing consoles that DJs could use to blend the records together. And you had, for the first time, light shows of various styles that were increasingly sophisticated, but at the same time increasingly affordable for clubs that might not, whose owners might not have the knowledge to find local musicians to play, or who might not want to take the risk as, oh, the musicians aren't showing up on time, the musician's drunk. I mean, yeah, don't get me wrong, I'm not by any means denigrating the quality of DJs, but it's always easier to replace one performer, DJ or otherwise, than multiple ones. And if worse comes to worse at a disco, you could always just put on a compilation LP. And if the drinks and drugs are good enough, they probably wouldn't recognize. A lot of the people in the disco might not know that there isn't a live DJ actively mixing various tunes. And so there are definitely those economic advantages. And so the technology was there, and the financial incentives behind the technology made it so that club owners all over the world were able to buy high quality direct drive turntables, a nice little mixer, a PA system that could play the music loudly and clearly, get the bass thumping, and, have, your mirror ball, which we call the disco ball, and some other light shows. I mean, some of the clubs had super sophisticated light shows, some less so, but the 70s was really the age where the light shows got very, very sophisticated. And I think that is really what made disco something different than just soul music with a simplified and relentless rhythmic style. So the technology of being able to have the phenomenon of the DJ and the discotheque, the disco, that was something that wouldn't have really been possible that much before the 1970s. Certainly not to the level of technical sophistication and sonic and visual precision that it was in the 70s. So the question now is, why at the end of the 70s was there so much backlash against disco? And so for here, we have to go back to the musical style. Now, there was never really any animosity. In fact, there was a lot of fusion, literal fusion, as well as mutual adoration between soul, R&B, funk on the one hand, the black styles on the whole, and the more white styles, your rock and roll and your singer-songwriter styles in the 60s and the early and mid 70s. Now, something totally unrelated to disco happened as the 70s became the 80s, and that's that FM radio, which had been very freewheeling. It was something that the corporations had no interest in when it really came out in the US, and it was left to sort of small hippie business owners, oxymoron maybe, to give great DJs, people like Jim Ladd, just free reign to play freeform radio. Now, as FM radio became more and more popular as a music listening medium, the corporations began to buy up some of these stations at a local level. It still wasn't possible for one corporation to own them all nationally. That was thanks to Bill Clinton, a much worse man than Jimmy Carter. Speaking of which. But in the late 70s, you did have sort of the beginnings of corporate control at the local level of FM radio. And what happened? Well, even as society was becoming more integrated, you were having radio becoming more segregated, where, okay, this is the station for young black people. This is the station for young white people. This is the station for older black people. This is the station for older white people. So the radio is segregating people. And while the music in terms of album sales definitely coexisted, if you were listening to the white station in 1978, you'd be hearing Foreigner and Boston and Journey and Dire Straits and the Doobie Brothers and early Van Halen, and Alice Cooper and Moody Blues and some of the prog rock on the more adventurous prog rock stations, the Yeses, the Genesises, the ELPs, the Moody Blues. Because apart from the UK where punk took over, this style of rock was still the king of rock. It was AOR, which itself was an outgrowth, a more pop aimed version of progressive rock. And so that was what you'd hear on the more rock-based white stations. On more of the soft white stations, you'd hear your Joni Mitchells, your Seals and Crofts, your James Taylors, the more singer-songwriter-y type of thing. And then on the black stations, what would you hear? You'd hear Kool and the Gang, you'd hear Ohio Players, you'd hear Angela Bofill, you'd hear Diana Ross's solo material, you'd hear Stevie Wonder, who owned radio stations in LA. You'd hear bands like Tavares, you'd hear bands like Chocolate Milk, like Mass Production, like the Isley Brothers. And so disco was something that weirdly in an age of segregation on the FM radio dial, it was in many ways something that defied these general trends. Because while the fundamental basis of disco was in soul music, which is primarily a black performed music and a black created music, disco had appeal across the board. Now, in some ways, disco's division was less about race than about economics, because disco implied the high life. If going to a Grand Funk Railroad concert implied wearing a pair of jeans, having a pack of Marlboros, and drinking a Bud, disco was all about champagne, chilled vodka, and stuff that goes up your nose, which isn't cheap, never has been. It's about, pulling up in a big Cadillac to Fleetwood, or, a Lincoln Mark V to the club. It's about the high life. And you can see why a lot of people from the world of clubs and even from the world of radio wanted to push disco heavily in the late 70s, so heavily that it almost became a victim of its own success, because disco was cheap to perform, because again, less expensive to hire a DJ than to hire a band, and the equipment didn't need to be moved in and out, because every band will have its different drums, its different amps, where with the DJ setup, two Techniques turntables, a good mixer, and a PA system, and one DJ can operate it to the next. The equipment stays in the club. So again, so many financial reasons why people wanted to do it, because if you had a rock music club, not only would you have to pay musicians, because rock fans weren't as keen to listen to a record of the rock music, so you'd have to pay the musicians, and selling beer and having people put their quarters, as it was then, in the cigarette vending machine wasn't as much of a high rolling thing as getting people so nosed up that they would spend money on bottles of Cristal like it was going out of style. And so these were trends that had nothing to do with the music. And so to recap this, you had increased segregation on the radio. Disco, though, had an appeal to all, but it was an aspirational appeal. Now, don't get me wrong, people who lived in trailer parks were dancing to disco in the 70s, but the overall vibe was one of aspiration, and the most famous disco clubs were all about throwing money around. Think Studio 54 and its various clones in big cities around the world. Now, you could say that a backlash was inevitable, because if a music is pushed on you relentlessly as that rhythmic pattern, of course there's going to be a reaction. And I would argue that although the verbal and physical and visual reaction to disco was big, that disco actually has outlived many of the genres that it supposedly was going against. Now, this goes to what a single event in time called the Disco Demolition Night at Kaminsky Field in Chicago. And this all began because a DJ called Steve Dahl was fired when his radio station in Chicago switched, for economic reasons probably, switched from rock to disco. And again, rock was still selling huge at this time, but this pissed him off, and so he organized an event called the Disco Demolition Night with the tagline "Disco Sucks," where people from around Illinois and elsewhere were encouraged to come to a White Sox game. And during the seventh inning stretch, they were not. It was a doubleheader, and between the two games, the idea was that they would, if I'm remembering that right, that they would take all of these disco records, put them in a crate, and blow it up with dynamite, and a tacky promo the way many FM radio stations promote it. And it turned into a rather large riot because the explosions were a bit more explosive than people realized, and people stormed the baseball diamond, and it was a bit of a mini riot. I don't think people were really hurt, but there was some property damage. The actual field was ruined. People were lighting fires and smashing stuff, and so their opposition to disco, you might think that that would make people think, okay, disco's great if all these miscreants dislike it, but it did represent people being fed up of a certain genre uh, being in everyone's face. And like most things, I would say that it was the victim of its own success. I mean, disco reached its height in late 77, and this was because of the extreme popularity of the film and best-selling soundtrack to Saturday Night Fever, which is the who's who of disco. It has the Bee Gees, it has Tavares, who again were a soul group that long pre-existed disco and had some very harmonically sophisticated. So the Bee Gees, you could argue they were a progressive pop band before disco. You had a fifth, the Beethoven by Walter Murphy, MFSB, again, pre-existing band from the Philadelphia area, Casey and the Sunshine Band, one of the most famous white disco groups and a really talented group. They were mixed. And once you have a film, once your genre goes Hollywood, there's nowhere for it to go but down. And that is what happened. It reached its peak. Everyone wanted to be John Travolta, and then it became too Hollywood. So all of these factors led to its decline. But did disco really die? Well, let's look at the music of the 80s that came after disco. The black radio stations were playing a new genre of funk soul called electrofunk. Think what the Isley Brothers did. They evolved into so many genres. Think of what they did with the great album Between the Sheets. Think of Atomic Dog. George Clinton shifts into this electrofunk movement. Think of a lot of Quincy Jones produced albums. While Michael Jackson's Thriller is sort of a genre in and of itself, a lot of the production was a highly sophisticated version of this electrofunk, and the electrofunk music of the early and mid 80s owes a lot to disco, as does the successor to electrofunk, the new jack swing style of dance music in the late 80s and early 90s. Think sort of Paula Abdul and Janet Jackson. So the idea that you would play music in a club off of a recording and dance to it, and that the beat would be obvious enough that good dancers could go wild and bad dancers could at least keep up, that didn't go away because of disco. So that's elements of the music, elements of the sociology, and elements of the technology that stayed. Because go to a dance club in the early 90s, let's say 1991, they'd be playing Janet Jackson and Vogue were just around the corner. You'd have a DJ, a couple of Techniques direct drive turntables, the PA system, the light show, the works. Visually, not all that different than the disco. The clothing changes, but the room and the equipment in it was largely the same. So I would argue also that new wave, in many ways, and the new romantic style of new wave in the early 80s, think things like Flock of Seagulls, if you combine European and really English punk rock with disco, that's sort of what you get, because these are people who put down the out of tune guitars and they bought an 808 drum machine, they bought synthesizers, and all of a sudden these people with spiky hair were playing music with a consistent beat that you could dance to, and some of it even got soulful. And so I would argue that disco inspired that. You could also make a sort of wider argument that so long as men and women want to do things to each other in a bedroom, so long as people like stimulants and other narcotics, and so long as people want to socialize, there will always be a disco. So I've given you the specific reasons that disco didn't really die, as well as some broader reasons. And then there's another reason. The technology behind disco and even some of the music, in addition, to be fair, to all of the soulful and funky music of the 70s, it paved the way for a brand new genre of lyrically driven, poetry driven music called hip hop. And what's really interesting about hip hop is it bridged the financial divide. So at a disco club, you would see the two turntables and a PA and a light show for people either who were wealthy or aspired to be wealthy. In the hip hop world, the idea of getting two used turntables, as it was for most kids, and playing it was that many of them couldn't afford musical instruments. But you could save up enough money, go to a pawn shop, and if a disco was closed because of, a DEA raid on them, you'd see a couple of Techniques turntables, small PA system, and a mixer in the pawn shop. And that is what happened with hip hop. You had people using the same musical technology to create new sounds. And even though the new sounds were very important, the key was that you had the two turntables and the microphone, because you had the MC rapping over the musical creations the DJ was making. So while ancient poetry, while blues, while R&B, while so many genres were predecessors to hip hop that helped make hip hop possible, both from a musical point of view, but also from a technological point of view, disco helped to make hip hop possible. And it's no coincidence that the first commercially successful hip hop song, the Sugar Hill Gang's "Rapper's Delight," used a sample of Chic's "Good Times," one of the most famous songs of the disco era. No coincidence indeed. So disco definitely lives on. And looking at the sociological aspect of it, I would say that if you want to know if you want to see it in sort of glamorized, look at Saturday Night Fever. If you want to hear the pomposity of the sociological aspects exposed, listen to the song "Dancing Fool" by Frank Zappa from the "Shake Your Booty" album. Spelt like an Arab sheikh. A parody itself of Casey and the Sunshine Band. Listen to the lyrics, and that will show you the pomposity of disco culture, which in many ways is a bit more endearing than some of the more violent dance club cultures that we have today. But I'll leave you with this. Disco didn't dethrone rock and roll. It was very popular, but from the mid 60s to the early 2000s, the leading idiom of pop music was rock music. But what happened in the 2000s? Rock music has retreated, and the music that now is the musical idiom of pop music today is dance music that is basically a watered down version of hip hop production. And if hip hop owes a lot of its origins to disco, and if today's pop is all about dancing, you could really say that in an age where rock and roll is really not cool anymore, that maybe disco had the last laugh. You let me know what you think of all of this in the comments. Maybe you like disco. Maybe you think disco sucks. Maybe you think, as I've tried to do today, to take a moderated approach and show that there's no such thing as objectivity in music to a degree. We've talked about that before. There is in terms of tonality. But music that was widely loved by all people helped to create disco. And a lot of music that loads of people love was created by disco. So maybe we're all John Travolta dancing it up after all. Like, subscribe, and we'll see you as always next time. Take care.